I'm going to show you a wonderful game by Mikhail Tal. And this follows on from a game I showed you in the last video where Wesley So won on the black side of a Spanish. Let's have a look at that. There's the Ray Lopez, or the Spanish opening. So this game is Mikhail Tal against Johann Hjartarson, and the Wesley So game had similar kind of contours to this one. It immediately, brought to mind this game played in Reykjavik in 1987. It is, well, just another of Tal's memorable games. So here we go. Mainline Spanish, absolute mainline. Rook e1. So now white threatens to take on c6 and take the pawn on e5. Therefore b5, bishop b3, castles and c3. So black has the opportunity to play the Marshall Gambit here. Hjartarson doesn't go for it. I should mention that Johann Hjartarson, of course, one of Iceland's strongest players, multiple times Icelandic champion, also qualified for the Candidates series, and, well, a very, very strong player. So it's the old main line of the Spanish, the so-called Chigorin variation with queen c7. The queen defends the pawn on e5. And this knight begins this typical Spanish maneuver. And now it has options perhaps to come to e3, perhaps g3, sometimes even h2. And Hjartarson starts playing on the c-file. The knight protects the bishop. This knight jumps back, puts a bit of pressure here, so time to close the middle, d5. Knight b4 hits the bishop, which just dives back to b1. That bishop is protected twice by these two and only attacked twice, so it's safe. a5 gives the knight a square on a6. a3, knight a6, and here a very clever move from white. Tal didn't discover this move, but he follows, as other players have done in the past, b4. Clever move, very important, because if that knight were to arrive on c5, then black has pretty good counterplay. But this pawn, as is so often the case in the Spanish, just deprives that knight of a good square, and this is a big problem for black now. By the way, that can't be taken because of bishop d2. The knight can't drop back because of the rook. And queen c5, queen b3 wins the knight, traps the knight. So b4 just played, and g6. So black is trying to get counterplay by bringing the knight out to h5. Bishop d2 just secures the pawn and threatens to take here, so pawn takes pawn. Very interesting, here Hjartarson exchanged pawns. Many years later, this position was repeated, well, it's repeated by many people, but this was a game that Morozevich played with black. He played knight h5. Now watch this, this is really interesting. So if pawn takes pawn, then of course the knight will have a square to come to on c5. Knight f1, bishop d8, a very important maneuver in this variation. We saw this a little bit in the Wesley So game. Queen b7, so that's making room for that bishop to come to b6 on this really important diagonal. Bishop h6, and now Morozevich simply gave up the exchange here. And that means that this bishop does not have an opponent. And there's potential to play on the dark squares. Now, that's reasonable compensation for black. And it makes me think of the Wesley So game, because Wesley didn't give up an exchange, but he also managed to grab that dark square bishop, and it's a similar case here. Black simply has good compensation for the exchange. Not the advantage yet, but interesting compensation. Anyway, that's a little diversion. Instead, Hjartarson exchanged on b4 and played queen b7. So he's also perhaps looking to bounce that bishop round to b6, which would indeed give black some pretty nice counterplay. So bishop d3. So this bishop comes into the fray again. Now the problem with bishop d8 here is that queen e2 hits the b pawn, so it's difficult to play that move. Knight h5 has been tried here in another game. That's also reasonable. But anyway, knight c7. Hjartarson brings knight back. And he's looking to play it round to the king side somehow. And now Tal decides, okay, well, what next? You know, black has some kind of security. The pawns are locked in the middle. That gives white a nice space advantage. That's why I always liked playing the white side of the Spanish, this lovely space advantage. And there is a square that you can hope to occupy, and that's the square on c6, which is why Tal played knight c2. So the knight might come here to attack this pawn, but it might also be looking to maneuver to a5 and getting on the c6 square. That's really the square that I would be looking towards. A very well-known theme in these kind of Spanish positions, and in King's Indian as well, actually. And if you think back to the Van Foreest Wesley So game, Van Foreest also used the c6 square as a jumping off point. So knight h5, Hjartarson looking to get counterplay here. Bishop e3, rook a8. Well, obviously, you know, there's potential for that rook to come down here. Rook a8. Changing pieces, you know, could help perhaps to relieve a bit of congestion. But, well, Hjartarson basically has his eye on some counterplay on the king side. And here, bishop h6 played. And an interesting moment, Hjartarson brought the knight back. And it's possible just to move the rook. But, well, thinking about that Morozevich game, it's also possible to sacrifice the exchange. And, you know, this pawn perhaps will drop off at some moment. You've got to be very careful about this diagonal. But it's about those dark squares again. You know, black does find a little bit of counterplay. Weak pawn. This bishop has potential to come into the game at some moment, maybe on this diagonal. Well, not at the moment, obviously, but there is potential there. But knight g7 played. But I mean, I do think that white had the advantage in that line. It certainly wasn't as good as the Morozevich sacrifice. But this is starting to look very nice for white. That knight is on its way to c6. f4. Well, I think Hjartarson was basically, you know, trying to break the connection here. And you never know. You know, it might be possible to use this diagonal because these black pawns control these squares. And now we have the same pawn structure as the Van Foreest Wesley So game. But of course, this one is a bit different. Black doesn't have the same counterplay on the queen side. So knight a5. The knight continues its hop round. And rook c1. There we go. The knight is about to jump into c6. Rook a8. Now white's got to be a little bit careful here about allowing counterplay down the a file. But queen c2 hits the knight. The knight goes back to e8. And here's the point that Tal was looking at, just manoeuvring his queen over, putting on the same diagonal as the king, which starts to set up this sacrifice. You know, black has to pay attention the whole time now. So that's why bishop f6 was played, to just guard that pawn. Now knight c6. Well, it's dream square. It's absolutely beautiful. But, well, white still has to break through here. It's not so simple. But here is where Tal starts manoeuvring really nicely. Queen b2. Why did he play queen b2? Well, one thing is that if this knight comes into g3, there's a pin. You can play king h2. And because the queen is protecting the pawn, the knight is just going to have to move away again. So that's one thing. But the other thing was, with queen b2, I think he was anticipating Hjartarson's next move, bishop g7. which was played, you know, this bishop is a bit uncomfortable for the king, so Hjartarson exchanges it off. Bishop takes, and here actually knight h takes g7 is still reasonable for black. Although the knight is wonderful, white still has to find a breakthrough. But king takes g7 is a mistake. Not obvious to see why this is a mistake. I mean, maybe Hjartarson was looking at moves such as this, but this doesn't work very well actually. I mean, one thing is this, that queen can come across and pin. Now, I realise it's possible to play queen takes. That's obviously dangerous, but I think the king can slip out there. It's not completely convincing, basically. But this move from Tal, rook c5, is really powerful. Wonderful idea, actually. So basically, he just wants to take a pawn. If pawn takes rook, then you can take here. Now white's a rook down, but the queen on the same diagonal as the king, the bishop threatened, and also a discovered check, winning the queen. So I mean, this is just too much, basically. So Hjartarson played queen a6. Rook takes b5. So Tal has won a pawn, but hang on, it's still not so clear. After knight c7, you can see the rook is attacked, and if it moves, then queen takes bishop. But Tal had foreseen this and played a rook b8, giving up that bishop. But now he came in with the next sacrifice. Knight c takes e5. Well, we'll see what happens in a second if that's taken. This happened, check. Yeah, now if pawn takes, then queen takes, and this leads to a forced checkmate. Like this. I mean, this is all checks, basically. It's terribly easy. And then mate on g5 on the next turn. So king h2 just played. And black can't take here. And there's interesting discovered checks happening. You know, watch out for rook takes and then knight check, and well, at the very least, there's going to be a knight takes rook, which just leaves. Let me just show that check here, and that leaves white 2 pawns up with a completely winning position. Well, let's come back here. So we've just had a check and the king comes here. And Hjartarson played rook a1, threatening a checkmate. Knight g4, discovered check. King has to come to f7. Knight check. King e7. And now, final move of the game, knight g8 check here. Hjartarson resigned. If king f7, then knight g5 is checkmate. There we go. That's rather nice. So all these squares are covered, and of course the rook covers there. Just wonderful. In that final position, that's where Hjartarson resigned. Let's just look at the journey of that knight. So, you know, everyone thinks of Tal as producing wonderful combinations. Well, and we saw a wonderful combination here. Nice piece of calculation and very creative, you know, playing this rook to c5. But there was a lot of maneuvering in this game, and which is so common in the Spanish, and is one of the reasons why I like the opening. It's so rich strategically. So let's look at the journey of that knight on g8. So it started on b1, d2 to f1, typical Spanish maneuver, then e3, c2, a1, b3, a5, c6, sacrifice on e5, then a discover check, and then finally knight g8. That is quite a tour. It reminds me of, you know, that old mathematical problem, the knight's tour, where the knight has to move to every single square on the board without retracing its steps, without stepping on the same square twice. There we go. One of my many favourite Tal games. A lot of you are saying that, well, you know, when you, I've shown lots of white wins with the Spanish, that it feels like a forced win, or it feels wonderful. You know, what is black doing playing this opening? But really, it is very rich, and it's, you know, you need such skill to play it with both sides. And that's why I was keen to show you, you know, Morozevich playing this very attractive idea of giving up the exchange, and that shows you the kind of strategic complexity in the opening. Anyway, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Let's hit 100k, and do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon. Check out the rewards, extra videos, newsletter when you subscribe via Patreon. Thanks for watching.